Okay, I'm just going to...
Hello, this is David Abrahams, Head of Legal at the ISM. It's 4 minutes to 1, so we're just gathering for today's webinar, an introduction to PPL. Thank you very much to those of you who've joined us. I will say a few words at 1 o'clock just as we start, but you want to be able to hear me. So if you can't hear me, you might want to type a message in the left-hand column, just telling us you're having technical difficulties. I can't hear you, so your way of communicating with us is by typing into the chat column, which you should be able to see on the left-hand side of your screen. So we've got some people who are with us already. If you could just reassure us by saying that you can hear us okay, or whether you've got any technical problems, if you could just let us know how you're getting on in that left-hand column, that would be reassuring, so we know that we have some form of communication. Other than that, I will wait for more people to gather, and we'll start promptly at 1 o'clock. And I've got great. I've had my first message saying that things are working, which is always a bit of a relief in these situations. I should say you'll be hearing more from him later, but on my right, to your left, is Dan Millington from PPL. I'm going to start off the presentation, and then Dan will be taking over for the nitty-gritty. So we've got about 3 minutes, so we will start promptly at 1 o'clock. Great. Well, according to my clock on this computer, it is now 1 o'clock, so we can get started. Thanks to everybody who's joined the webinar today. My name's David Abrahams, as you may know already. I'm Head of Legal at the ISM. I'm welcoming Dan Millington from PPL, who is the former development manager. Dan, say hello again.
Hello there.
Just a few ground rules before we get started into the meat of the webinar. You should be able to hear me and Dan and see us. We can't hear you, so if you want to communicate with us, you need to type in a text message in the chat column, which you should be able to see on the left-hand side of your screen. So if you've got any questions about what we're covering in the webinar, or any technical issues that you're having problems with, we have a technical team, Kerry and Kim, who are helping out this afternoon. They'll try and sort those out. Words just about the structure. I'm going to give some introductory comments, really, about the legal context for performers' rights and where PPL fits into all of that. So that's going to take about 10 minutes, I should think. And then I'm going to hand over to Dan, and he's going to take you through some of the more detailed stuff about exactly how PPL works, how you can join PPL, who should join PPL, and how you can maximise your income from PPL. Dan, I think, has got about half an hour's worth of material. So that should leave us with 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. So please do type in your questions as they occur to you. We probably won't break off to deal with them during the session, during the presentation part, but we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end, which Dan and I will try and answer. So I hope that all makes sense, and I'll get started on the meat of my bit of the presentation, which is about the law on performers' rights, which really provides the context for the work that PPL does with performers. Where do you find the law on performers' rights? As I've said there, it's all set out in one particular statute, Part 2 of the Copyright Design and Patents Act 1988. There's been quite a lot of amendments to that act since 1988, so lots of things have been added. But the way it's been done is everything's been kept together in Part 2 of the Act. So if you're feeling particularly keen or interested and you want to see chapter and verse on some of this stuff that we're dealing with, that's where you can find it. You can find the CDPA on the internet if you want to have a look. And there are three main types of rights which are granted to performers under the Act. These are property rights, non-property rights, and moral rights. Three different types of rights, and I'm going to go on and explain what those rights are. So let's look first of all at property rights. Performers have the right to authorise the reproduction or distribution of any recorded performance. So you can't, if you're recorded, the starting point is that the record producer can't run off and start reproducing that performance and distributing it without your agreement and consent. Another property right is the right to equitable remuneration for the playing in public, broadcast or rental of commercially produced sound recordings. Really everything Dan's going to say about PPL relates to equitable remuneration and how the system which has developed and is in place to ensure that performers get the equitable remuneration they're entitled to when their recordings are played in public or broadcast. So that's where PPL fits in. Moving on to the non-property rights, really important these. Performers need to give their consent to any live broadcast of their performance and to any recording of their performance. So if anyone records you or broadcasts you illicitly without your consent, that, strictly speaking, is a breach of your non-property rights under the CDPA. And similarly, it's also a breach of your rights if an illicit recording, a recording you haven't agreed to, is distributed for any commercial purpose, whether that be streaming or being sold in the form of a CD or broadcast. You have the right under the Act to object to any commercial use of a recording that's been made without your consent. Let's move on then to the third category of performers' rights. These are the moral rights of performers. These are the rights to be identified as a performer, provided you've asserted that right in a written assignment. and the right to object to any distortion or modification of that performance that would be prejudicial to your reputation. So those are the important moral rights. Now you may say, well, this is, just skipped ahead slightly. You may say, well, this is all very well, but in practice, performers are expected to assign these rights away. That is correct, but it does have to be in writing if you're going to assign your rights under the CDPA. So what generally happens, as many of you will be aware, is that before you do any commercial recording, you'll be asked to sign a consent or waiver form. That will relate to your property rights because you can't actually assign your non-property rights. And similarly, often you'll be asked to waive your moral rights. They can be waived, they can't be assigned. And so what that means is, you'll be asked to say, yeah, I'm happy. If you're, for example, if you're a session musician, you might not expect to be identified as a performer on that recording, and therefore you would waive your moral right to be identified as a performer. But important to be aware what can be assigned, what can't be assigned, what waiver means, what assignment means. Really importantly, the right to equitable remuneration cannot be assigned. So whatever document you may have signed prior to doing a commercial recording, it doesn't affect your right to equitable remuneration. And that means that in all circumstances, you should join up with PPL and make sure you get the equitable remuneration which PPL distribute, because you are definitely entitled to that, regardless of anything you may have signed at the time. And the other really important thing about these consent, assignment or waiver forms is you should read them and understand them. I know there's a culture in the music industry of just thinking, well, I have to sign it, I won't worry about what it says. But that is bad practice. It's not professional. You need to understand these are valuable rights. You need to understand what you're doing with them and the consequences of signing. If in doubt, seek advice. You can call the ISM if you're an ISM member from the recording studio and do take queries like that where people are uncertain about something they're being asked to sign. So definitely, if you're in any doubt about the forms you're being given, do seek advice beforehand, before you sign on the dotted line. I'm going to move on. How long do performers' rights last? Very exciting for us, people who are interested in copyright and performers' rights. Law changed in November 2013. There was a big campaign to extend the term of copyright from 50 years to 70 years. That was successful. So that means that from anything that was in copyright, a recording that was in copyright in November 2013, which is most recordings released from 1963 onwards, copyright will now be extended for 70 years from the date in which the recording was originally released. There are some special rules about session musicians and a funding set up for them, which was all part of the package that European Parliament agreed. So if you do have, if you were a session musician on recordings from 1963, you may now have new rights to income because of this change in the law. I won't go into that in any detail today, but if you've got queries about that, come back to us. But basically, the law is now 70 years rather than 50. And a bit more about claiming equitable remuneration. Dan's going to cover this in much more detail, but I'm just going to say a few words about it. PPL represents performers and record companies. It licenses the playing of recorded music in public and the broadcast of recorded music on TV and radio and certain digital media services. Membership of PPL is free for performers, so we highly recommend everyone who has ever performed on a commercially released recording to join PPL, in order that you can be part of the system that allows you to claim equitable remuneration. And I've already mentioned the help that the ISM provides. We have our in-house team. We have a 24-hour helpline. So if you've got, if you need advice about any of the issues that I've touched on in this bit of the presentation, then do if you're an ISM member, you can contact us at the email address I've given, legal@ism.org, or on our telephone number 020 7221 3499. There's also a 24-hour helpline, and details of that are on our website. So that ends the ISM bit of the presentation. I hope that's given you an idea of how PPL sits within the legal framework. I'm now going to hand over to Dan to give PPL's perspective on all of this. So Dan, thanks for coming, and I'll hand over to you next.
Hello there. I'm Dan. I'm the Performer Development Manager with PPL. So I'm going to run through this. Obviously, I'd just like to thank ISM for inviting us to participate today. So let's crack on. So just a quick overview of what we're going to cover. So I'll do an introduction to PPL, and then we'll kind of do some overviews in terms of where PPL sits, everything, what you need to do to become a PPL member, and then we will I'll go through some tips to maximise your payments, and then at the end, David and I will take some questions. So essentially, PPL, in a nutshell, I guess PPL are the UK's licensing body for the use of recorded music. So that's a key thing. It's about the recording itself. So we license use of recording on TV, radio, in any sort of public performance as well, so shops, pubs, clubs, anywhere like that. So anywhere where a recording is used, or anybody that uses a recording in a public sense has to pay PPL a license fee to be able to do that. It's then our job to make sure that that money is distributed between the performer members and also the rights holder members as well. One of the key questions that I often get asked about PPL is the difference between us and PRS. Has historically been a bit of a sort of been confusion around, whether or not you need to be members of both societies, or even if we compete as societies, which we don't. So the key thing is that PPL, we're here to protect the recording copyright, whereas PRS are there to protect, or PRS and music even are there to protect the composition, the songwriting, publishing side of things. So just to give you an example, if I were to write a song and record a song, so I'm a singer-songwriter, let's say, and my music gets played on Radio 1, I will receive a royalty from both PPL and PRS, and that's because I'm on the recording. I've made an audible contribution, and that's the key thing. With PPL, our members, anybody that receives PPL revenue, essentially, it's about the audible contribution. So even if you go onto go into the studio and clap your hands, you've gained a legal right to equitable remuneration. But I will receive a payment from both PPL and PRS because I wrote the song and I performed on the recording itself. Now, if I was to do a cover of someone else's song, so I'm recording a cover, PRS will pay the original songwriter, publisher, whereas PPL will pay me because I'm on the actual recording itself. It's also worth mentioning as well that VPL, which you may come across, is the video side of the licensing that PPL do. So record labels will register videos with PPL. So we license videos in for use on things like MTV Europe, etc. At the moment, performers do not qualify for any extra remuneration on music videos, though that may change in the not too distant future. Excellent. Okay, so I kind of covered this a little bit, but obviously the key question is who can join PPL, and the simple answer to that is anyone who has made any kind of audible contribution from a performance point of view on a record should be a PPL member. And joining PPL is pretty straightforward. You go to the website there, so ppluk.com. Once you're on that website, there's a little section at the top that says My PPL. You click on that and it takes you through to this page that you can see here, and then you're going to select the option on the bottom left, which is not PPL member. Provide a few details, so as email address, name, etc. That will set up your My PPL account, after which you'll log into My PPL and you'll be able to go through registration. As David said, the actual joining PPL is completely free, so there's no cost associated with it whatsoever. And it's also important to note that there are two memberships of PPL. So there's a performer membership and a rights holder membership, the rights holder being the record label. And key to bring sort of cover with that is that a lot of performers, I think about 60% of performers that sign to PPL these days are actually self-releasing artists. So they need to be a rights holder member with PPL as well as a performer member, because essentially they're the label. They own their own copyright, they own their own recording. In order for PPL to be able to properly license that recording, the rights holder needs to register with PPL and grant us the right to license that recording, which will then mean that the performer themselves can earn extra remuneration for the use of the music. Great. Obviously, this kind of income, it has been referred to as neighbouring rights in some regards, but the revenue that PPL collects on public performance broadcasts and online and then international is becoming an increasingly significant income stream now for performers. Even those that are sort of starting out, new bands, etc., it can actually help pay for the petrol when you're doing that first tour around the UK. But it's last year alone we distributed, you can see here on the public performance side, 69.5 million. Broadcast and online 73 million, and international, which I'll come on to later, was 34 million last year. And the international side, which is often referred to as neighbouring rights. So as a performer, if you're on any recording that's being used, it's being played on the radio, you are legally entitled to a share of this money, which is why it's important for you to join PPL. So as I mentioned before, who do we pay? So rights holders, so that's the record companies and obviously the self-releasing artists, who are essentially the label or the record company themselves, and the performers who qualify. Now, from a performance point of view, we have three sort of categories of performance on a record. So you have your contracted featured artists. So this is the artist that has the agreement or the deal in place with the record label. So they are contracted to the record label. They're the main artists. Generally the reason why people buy the record, they're the ones who are the named artists or bands or whatever. If you're a self-releasing performer, you are not technically contracted to yourself, but you are a contracted artist because you're the main artist. We have non-featured performers. Now this is typically session musicians. That entitles you to a cap of about 8% for performance on a record. It's also important actually just to explain very briefly the splits and how it works. So we do a 50-50 distribution. So 50% of any revenue generated goes to the record label. The other 50% gets split down between the people that are performers on that record itself. Now contracted featured artists will earn the lion's share of that. So typically 65%, so we have one contracted featured artist, 65% of that revenue will go to that artist. The non-featured or the session players will share a pot of 35%. So if I have an 80-piece orchestra on my records, they will share about 35%, about 0.5% each, something like that. Finally, we have other featured performers. So this is, for example, when Florence and the Machine did You've Got the Love, and Dizzy Rascal performed on that record. He was another featured performer. So he's not contracted to her label, the agreement is with her, so it makes him a featured artist or another featured artist. And typically another featured artist would earn around a third of what your contracted artist would earn. And so I've also put a little note in there, costs. PPL's UK operating costs, so it's important to note we're a not-for-profit organisation. Our UK operating costs are just over 14%. That's deducted before the revenue is ever allocated to anyone. It's actually, so when the revenue comes into PPL at the beginning of each year, we deduct our operating costs from that, and then we go on to allocate. 14% is actually, it's been like that with us now for 5 years, and it's come down quite a long way actually. I think at one point it was more like 25%. So we've had some good work done there to bring those costs down as low as we can. Brilliant. So next thing I'm going to do is kind of go through some tips that you as performers can do, things that you can do with PPL to make sure that you're maximising your payments with us. So first one is using my PPL itself. Every performer member, every rights holder member have access to my PPL. Once you create your account, you can use that account to, you can see here, to update your personal information. So that can be your address, your bank details, all of that sort of thing, contact details, etc. You can actually use my PPL as a portal to ask PPL questions. So you can raise queries with PPL through that portal. We have a dedicated team in the office who will respond directly to those queries. So you can do the whole thing through my PPL. Key, obviously, to maximising payments is using my PPL to make claims. So we have a repertoire database that you get access to. That gives you access to every single recording on our system, which at the moment is over 7 million recordings. So this is the metadata behind those recordings. As a performer member, what you can do is kind of, I guess, in a way, it's sort of like shopping on Amazon or something. We have a sort of claims basket, so you can go and find the recordings that you've performed on. You select those recordings, and then you make your claim on those recordings. So when you're making a claim, what you're doing is you're telling us what you did on that recording, so what your role was, your category, so were you a session player or therefore non-featured, or you contracted artist, etc. You provide that information to PPL. At that point, you can also provide us with evidence, and that's key, is having and making sure that you've got evidence that you performed on that recording. So that can be a label copy, it can be an MU consent form, anything that you've got that shows us that you performed on that record. And that's quite important that we do that, and that stops fraudulent claims on recordings. Initially, what you may notice if you make a claim on a recording that is a new recording on our system, your claim may be auto-accepted, so it'll go straight through, and that's because there's no value on that recording at that point. The moment that recording gets any revenue allocated to it, you will then be contacted by PPL and asked to provide us with some sort of evidence that you performed on that. So as a rights holder, also, this is key to everything we do. As a rights holder or a label, registering repertoire through my PPL is key. And if any of you that are watching this are rights holders, it's worth noting that you need to register as a rights holder and register repertoire within the year that you're releasing and that it's being used. So as an example, if I released a record today, so long as I register by the end of this year, it will be covered for any airplay that it has, as long as I'm a rights holder member and registered that recording with us. If it isn't registered within the year that it's used, PPL haven't been given a rights to license, and therefore we can't allocate revenue to it. By being a rights holder member, you'll also be given ISRC codes as well, so you'll get a unique ISRC code, and that is the International Standard Recording Code. That basically is a unique identifier that will provide you with the stem that you, when you register a recording with us, you'll allocate that to each single recording that you register. And that helps with when music gets played on the radio, they extract the ISRC code and report that back to PPL. The other thing you can do with my PPL is check your statements. So whenever we make a payment, you'll be able to go on there, download your statements. We don't send anything by post. We avoid using paper as much as possible. So you can go on there and check what your payments are. And you can apply for additional memberships as well. So that's adding additional labels, etc. So here we go. This is actually what my PPL looks like when you're a performer member. So you might not be able to read all of that, but essentially it kind of splits everything out. So you've got your account where you can update your details. You can look at recordings that you're linked to. And we've got the Action Centre, which is essentially where you can raise queries and claims with PPL. Somebody will respond back to you on those finally statements. So whenever we make a payment, you'll be able to go through that and do your statements. This is important. So again, using my PPL to update your personal details. This is one of the reasons why, one of the main reasons why payments don't make it through, and it's because we don't have correct information, or people change bank details. So payments will bounce and they don't inform us. So it's really important. I can't stress it enough that any of this information requires updating, that you go on and you do it as soon as possible. Because if we're not aware that something's changed, it could affect our ability to pay you properly. So again, you can use PPL to do that. So as a rights holder, it's really important that the repertoire is registered with PPL, as I've touched on. You register the recordings and the products. Perform a lineup. So if you are self-releasing, it's really important to let us know who performed that recording with you. So all of the session musicians and everybody associated with the recording. So that it makes things easier when it comes to payments. So if we've got the correct lineups on that, it means that the first time around we can make an accurate payment. We do provide adjustments, so people do make claims on recordings, there's an adjustment, and we have a 6-year period of limitation that we put into place for that. So we can backdate 6 years. But if we have the lineup correct from day one, it means that there's no need for those adjustments to take place further on. As a rights holder, you can also fix invalid recordings as well. Typically, this won't affect anybody that's registering as a rights holder now. Historically, anybody that's been a PPL rights holder, and using our old system, we didn't have the same checks that we do now. So some repertoire will go through. You may notice when you're trying to claim on a recording, you'll see a little red cross and sometimes a tick. From a performer point of view, that's nothing to worry about. It's purely around the label side of things. So what that cross is telling us is that the recording is invalid because the label hasn't provided us with certain information. But we still ensure that the performer receives their revenue on the recording songs they're linked to. Okay, so on the performer claims side of things, when you're in my PPL, this gives you, as I said before, this lets you search all the recordings that are on our database. You can look at recordings that you're not linked to, and this is where you can then make your claims. So you literally select the recording, to a little tick box next to the recording. You can select that, and then you can start submitting your claims, and it requests supply evidence as well. It's really important to make sure that when you do look at your repertoire, it's important to make sure that you're linked to the recording correctly in terms of contribution category. So again, because it can be, if you're linked to a recording as a contracted featured artist and actually you were a non-featured performer, that can result in quite a big negative adjustment depending on what the repertoire is. But as I said, supplying evidence will help with that, generally speaking. Okay, and so I mentioned this before, it's worth coming on to. So the international royalty side of things, increasingly, are becoming an increasingly important area of revenue, often referred to as neighbouring rights, somewhat incorrectly, but that's typically how it gets referred to. So PPL have reciprocal agreements in place with, from a performer point of view, it's over 34 different societies around the world. Any PPL performer that provides PPL with an international mandate, we will ensure that both you as a performer and the repertoire that you performed on is claimed in those territories, and we'll bring that revenue back and distribute it out. We actually do four distributions on the international side of things. They happen in March, June, September, and December. So we've just made one. So again, it's really worthwhile having this international mandate set up with PPL. You never know where your music's being used, and it'd be a shame if it's being played in places like Latvia, or Sweden, or wherever, and you're not collecting that revenue. Your rights still exist on those recordings. You also notice there that put down the 30% more on US royalties. So PPL have an agreement with US collection society called Sound Exchange. Now in America, they don't have the same rights that we do. So traditional broadcasts, AM, FM radio, etc., is not a license, or it's not licensed at all in the US, but they do license satellite and internet radio, which means that we can claim for our members in the US, and actually Sound Exchange distribute more money than any other society. I think it's around $450 million that was distributed last year. PPL are also what we call a qualified intermediary. That means that by providing PPL with a W8BEN form, so this is basically a tax form that enables us to pull through what previously would be withheld and paid to the IRS, pull that tax through. So it means that you will get 100% of what's being collected rather than 30% being withheld, and then you have to try and claim that back afterwards, and it will take a long time. You will be, if there are any US royalties for you and you don't have a QI form or qualified intermediary form signed at PPL, we will contact you as soon as there is any money there. So you don't need to worry about that until that point. We have a team that are kind of dedicated to working through that. Our international team is a big team now, and one of the key things there is it's a multilingual team, and it has to be. A lot of the societies don't communicate with PPL in English, so we have to make sure that that we've got the right team in place to be able to communicate properly with these societies, so that we can make sure we're maximising the money that we bring through. And this is just an overview here that you can see, which shows you the territories where we are collecting. Those areas in grey, generally speaking, they haven't implemented those rights, so they're not being collected on. One exception to that is Australia. Although Australia are a Rome Convention signatory, it's not essentially being properly implemented, which means that they only remunerate Australian artists. As of this year, the UK government decided that we would reciprocate on that basis, so PPL no longer pay Australian artists for UK airplay. The key thing there is, if there are any Australian artists listening, I don't know if there are, but my advice would be to, if you're going to be performing on any repertoire, or recording any repertoire, to not do it in Australia or America. Do it in a European territory. You then enable yourself to have money, or enable us to collect revenue for you globally. And this is the rights holder side. So we also collect for rights holders overseas as well, or different territories. Actually, more rights holder societies than there are performer societies. But again, if you are a rights holder, I strongly advise you to sign an international mandate with PPL. If you subsequently do any licensing agreements in different territories, you can inform PPL that you've done that, and we will remove that territory from your mandate, which means that there won't be double claims happening in those territories, which can cause conflict. As a rights holder as well, you have additional services that you can sign up to, and strongly recommend again. So these new service categories, new media services, include on-demand streaming, radio and TV, so things like BBC iPlayer, and also download to own programs as well. PPL will also license distribution of DVDs, CDs from TV programs, and again, typically for the BBC, those programs that end up on DVD are licensed or covered under the PPL blanket license. So again, by signing that agreement with us, or choosing that option, you're enabling, because the music will still be used. It just means that you'll be able to collect on it and get the money that you're due. So PPL will also, from a rights holder point of view, we will regularly contact to request further information about MTV claims. So PPL license MTV, we distribute on that annually. Any disputed recordings from the UK and overseas, we'll contact the rights holder about them. These are regular campaigns. So from a rights holder point of view, if there are any issues around that, you will be contacted. So you don't need to worry too much until that point. But it is important that you respond to those. That's the key thing. Just to kind of show you the statement side of things. So every time PPL make a distribution, you'll get access to your statements. This will tell you where it will tell you how much you've been paid, obviously, but it will also we provide a breakdown which will show you what recordings have been allocated revenue and what your share of that revenue is. But we'll also provide some airplay analysis as well, so you can see which radio stations are playing music, what your top 10 earning recordings are, etc. And that can be really useful, especially if you're in a band and you're starting out. It's good to know where your music's being played. You might want to go to that particular radio station and sort of do some work with them to play more of your music. So in June, PPL we do our UK distribution. So this is the main distribution for the previous year's airplay. So this June just gone, we paid out 2013 revenue. At the same time, we also do an international payment in June, which brings in all the revenue that we've been collected around the world. And there's also an adjustment. Now this adjustment is for claims that you've made to perform on previously unclaimed repertoire, so you add yourself to a recording. In that adjustment, the idea is that any revenue that you would have been paid over the last 6 years on that recording, that will be adjusted over to you and distributed out. We also do an adjustment in December as well, so there are 2 periods in the year where you can get back pay for any performances that you previously weren't linked to. And then this is just showing you the important dates. So we'll make sure that these are available. These are on our website. That these are both from a rights holder point of view and a performer point of view. Where so the key payment dates are going to be March, June, September, and December. So the 4 international payments in every single one of those payments that we made, and the main UK payment in June. And I think that's about it from me. I'm sure that's the last slide. Yeah. So are there any questions?
Yeah, we're now going to do our double act. I'm coming back into shot. Tweedledum, Tweedledee. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. You can type any questions you may have in the chat column on the left-hand side, and we'll do our best to answer them. But in the meantime, because we don't have any questions just at the moment, I've got some questions for Dan based on what he just said. So hopefully it might be useful. First one, a really simple one. You advise people to sign up for international royalties, Dan. Is there any cost for doing that?
That's all. No, so that's completely free, just like the UK membership.
Yeah.
And all you're doing essentially is tapping into an additional income that you would be collecting otherwise. It's worth noting there are commercial organisations that will collect international revenue or labelling rights revenue. They will charge a commission for collecting that revenue, and often will outsource part of the collection of that money as well.
Okay, so PPL doesn't take any commission.
Absolutely not. No. We have operating costs on international collection, which historically kind of fluctuated between 2 and 10%. We had a cap of 10%. We are now implementing across the board our operating costs for international 7% for any territory. And that will be visible on statements as well. That's literally the cost for us to collect that money.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's well worth for people signing up for that.
Yes, absolutely.
Here's a question we've got from one of our members. With PPL being a non-profit organisation, what happens to the millions of pounds you've collected and can't distribute? That's a good
question. So, firstly, to kind of sort of dispel the myth, there isn't a black box at PPL where we put unallocated money. Every single penny that we have at PPL is allocated to a recording. So that's the first thing to say. If a recording or if a revenue isn't claimed by a performer, we hold that revenue for 6 years, and then each year we drop years. So this year will be dropped to 2007. Now that revenue is then redistributed across our membership. So we look at 2007. What we'll do is we'll look at who were members in 2007, who received payments in 2007, and we'll pro rata that closing distribution periods, and we'll pro rata across the membership. So we do have a way of distributing it, and that's we feel the fairest way to do it. So it happens to be the year that Mr. Robbie is number 1. That's exactly the one getting the most payment. So for example. So,
Okay, so there is a system in place to distribute that money. We've got another question here. One of our members played as a brass session musician for £10 cash when I was 18, but had no evidence or contract that you played. My name's on the album cover as a performer. Would that be sufficient evidence then?
Should be, yeah. We PPL distribute on a track level. Or we have a track level distribution, should I say. So ideally, we want to see that you perform a specific recording. If your name being on the album cover shows that, then that's absolutely fine. My advice would be to get in contact with PPL, with our member services department, who will be able to look at that, at the evidence that you've got, and confirm whether or not it's sufficient. I would imagine it would be then.
But in terms of, I mean, it sounds as if that might have been some time ago. I know it's maybe one of our younger members. But is there a sort of, in terms of backdating claims for money, does everything you said that things get closed after 6 years?
So we have a 6-year period of limitation.
So you can't, if you've only just kind of joined PPL, you're not going to get income from use of a recording of, more than 6 years ago. So.
Correct, yeah. But it's the key thing is that, even if the recording came out 10 years ago, it's still important to make sure your link to continue to be used individually. So on that.
Indeed. I've got another question. Sometimes I get feedback from performers that their record labels that they've performed for are not very efficient in terms of communicating with PPL and making sure PPL will have all the information they need. What can you do? What can a performer do if they think that they've got a record label that's just being inefficient, not doing their job properly?
Yeah, I mean the performer's right isn't an exclusive right, which means ultimately registering the recording with PPL is down to the label, and it's up to them whether they do that or not. Generally speaking, a label will register a recording with us because they want to make sure they're getting any money they can, especially in this sort of climate of the music industry at the moment, and sort of income streams. A performer can obviously have a claim system, so you can use that to make sure that you are linked to your recordings, regardless of what the rest of the information that the label's provided. But also PPL have implemented a data policy 3 years ago, which is strongly encouraging the labels to, making the labels, the rights holders, provide us with sort of a higher standard of data. And that's a data policy that's continually being reviewed. We'll be implementing new parts of that in the coming months and years, which will focus on the label and the information they're providing us to help perform a lineup side of things. At the moment, as a label, if you register a recording with us, you have to provide us with some sort of lineup. That it's hard to have a systematic way to verify that information, and that's what we're looking at in the future. So yeah, we're well aware of that. But
it sounds like there's more work to be done. You're working on it. We just had some more questions coming in. A question: is it pointless to claim for anything before 2007 if I signed up now? Now, my understanding of what Dan said, the point is it's well worth, even if your recording was made many years ago, long before 2007, it's well worth joining PPL because if that recording is still being used, still being played in public, broadcast on TV or radio, then you want to start getting that revenue. So it is worth signing up with PPL. But no, in terms of the recording being used before 2007, unfortunately, the opportunity has been missed.
yeah, and the revenue would be best, but it's important to link up to it anyway. You just never know when something's going to get used. If it was recorded 10, 15, 20 years ago, can still earn money. That's a lot of our high-end recordings were made well before 2007.
Yeah. Another question, since PPL has admitted there are millions of recordings from the 20th century with no ISRC code, would it be a good idea to invest spare revenue in the technology to recognise and identify a recording? Can you comment on that at all, Dan?
I think not having an ISRC code doesn't mean that there's spare money. We have other ways of identifying recordings. We have matching systems in place. And not having an ISRC code on a recording means that that recording in our system is invalid, but we do a lot of work with those rights holders to try and get that information. As a side note, we are looking at technology. We're doing some tests in terms of recognising recordings that are being used. So things sort of Shazam type technology, but much better because it needs to identify versions of the recording as well, versions of the recording. So that's something that we're looking at. And I mean, from our point of view on the system, we certainly don't have millions of recordings out ISRC codes. There are a number, but we are working with the rights holders to get that information.
Another question. If a recording is released under a Creative Commons license, how does that affect the rights of musicians on the recording, if at all?
Well, this is kind of like library music, and typically speaking, library music is not registered with PPL. The rights holders do not grant the right to PPL to license those recordings. What that means is that anybody that's performed on those recordings will not receive any extra remuneration for the use of those recordings. That's how library music typically works. You as part of the agreement that you sign with them, you'll receive a fee for your performance on that record. But as the rights holder, they won't register. They won't register those recordings with us, so there's no revenue generated.
So that's a really important thing to be aware of if you're doing any work for library music or under a Creative Commons license. Again, it goes back to what I was saying in my bit about reading the small print. That will be dealt with, I would expect, in the consent form that you sign at the time, the contract you sign at the time. They can do that because although you have the right to extra remuneration, the law doesn't say it has to be equitable remuneration as distributed by PPL. There are other ways that companies can do that. So you do need to watch out for those music library and Creative Commons licenses because they're going to be out for that. They will certainly fall outside the PPL system. Yeah. There might be a reason to negotiate a higher fee at the outset. So that's something we can certainly advise on. Just another question I have, Dan, actually, which is about YouTube and Spotify. Obviously, PPL, the extra remuneration right is generated from broadcast on TV and radio, recordings being played in public. But my understanding is that when music is streamed on YouTube or Spotify, the right isn't engaged and the income doesn't flow from PPL. Is that correct? And are there any, I know performers feel that is very unfair because obviously streaming is becoming, every year that passes is becoming a more important part of the business. And is anything being done to change that position?
Well, it's quite right. PPL don't license either YouTube or Spotify. The reason we don't license it is the rights holders have direct agreements in place with YouTube and Spotify, which means they get paid directly by those music platforms, video platforms, and YouTube. That means that because we're not licensing it, we're not able to collect or distribute any revenue to performers. It all goes through the rights holder of the label. PPL at the moment, we in terms of online, PPL are licensing non-interactive services. So this is where essentially it's a broadcast but online. So where you're not able to select exactly what you're listening to, you can't jump around and select which songs you want to listen to. That's an interactive service. We don't license anything like that at the moment. There have been conversations with Spotify, but ultimately this is all down to the rights holders and the labels, people that own the recordings. Because they own the recordings, they can choose how they want to deal with those recordings. And at the moment, they want to deal with Spotify and YouTube directly. And that means that we're out of that. Online revenue is something revenue stream through PPL is still relatively small compared to traditional broadcast and public performance, but it is something that we will obviously continue to grow in the coming years as it becomes a more mainstream, or the mainstream takes over the likes of radio.
Could you just clarify that point about what is and is not covered by this PPL license? So you're saying Spotify and YouTube, no, but am I right in thinking that something like Big CI Player, 4OD, those kind of on-demand services from broadcasters, TV and radio, they are all still covered within PPL, so people will still get extra remuneration for that, for those kinds of uses?
Yeah, absolutely. So those services are all licensed, so iPlayer being the key one. So again, if your music you use sort of what we have the incidental use of music, so the Queen Vic as background as and then that gets played again on iPlayer, you will continue to generate revenue through PPL because it's all covered under one IP license with those broadcasters. Whereas Spotify, YouTube, sort of direct licensing with the labels, which means that our banking license doesn't apply, and so no collection on that side of it. Labels will typically pass on something from those services to performers, generally the contracted performers, but start to know exactly what that's averaging. It'd be nice if we did license Spotify.
Well, indeed, and my worry is for the often session musicians to complete that buyout. So there aren't any beyond the initial fee. There is no provision in the contract for payments. Obviously, that's not a problem where it's licensed by PPL because you pay to everybody. But it is an issue when there's substantial use of the recording outside the PPL system, which is a concern for us. I'm just having a look at the column. Here we do have a new question. Why has PPL drawn the line at 6 years? Surely if you collected money before then you have title for the track or album. Surely it should be available for performers who now play.
That's a good question. I mean, 6 years is it's a standard period of limitation across lots of industries. The banking and all that, 6 years is the standard thing. We implemented that period of limitation purely because PPL are there to distribute revenue. We're not there to sit on revenue. If we have a completely open distribution period, unclaimed revenue will just continue to grow and grow and grow. And we made a decision that actually we want to have a period of limitation. And we will, that means that it's not going to be an infinitely growing pot of money that we're unable to distribute because the performance is playing. We know that who's playing on our particular recordings. So we implemented that about three years ago. It's still a good period of time to claim, but it just means that we can reallocate revenue rather than just sitting there in the bank, because that's not what we're there to do. We're there to hold on to them.
And just to sort of underline that, the 6 years, I mean, there is and there has been for many years something called the Limitation Act, which says that after a period of time you're not allowed to start legal proceedings. And the limitation period, very long established limitation periods of breach of contract claims, is 6 years. So I suspect that may well have been in PPL's mind when it set up the system in that way. Dan, unless there's anything you particularly want to add, I think there's been a really good discussion we've had. Thank you very much indeed to people who've attended the webinar today. Thanks for your questions and some interesting, varied and quite challenging questions for us. I hope you found it useful. This presentation will be available on our website probably early in the new year. So if you want to go back and listen to it again, look at the slides again, you will be able to do that along with everybody else with access to the ISM website. But thank you very much for your participation and for your questions. I hope you found it useful. Thank you again to Dan. It's been really great to have him come along today and for us to hear the information from the horses now, so to speak. That's been great. And thank you very much for your participation. I think I'm now going to bring the webinar to a close.